A Boeing 747, 524 souls on board. A catastrophe at 24,000 feet. This is the haunting story of Japan Airlines Flight 123, the worst single aircraft accident in aviation history, and one of the most tragic tales of human endurance, mechanical failure, and a crew that fought valiantly to the very end. On August 12, 1985, a Japan Airlines Boeing 747 SR stood parked at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, preparing for a routine domestic flight to Osaka. The aircraft had just completed an earlier flight, and after off-boarding its previous passengers and a quick turnaround, it was being readied for departure again. Obon holiday season had brought tens of thousands of Japanese citizens back home to visit their families. Among them were 509 passengers, joined by 15 crew members, including a highly experienced cockpit team. Captain Masami Takahama, 49, had logged over 12,000 flight hours. First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, 39, was undergoing evaluation for promotion to captain, with 3,900 hours under his belt. Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, 46, sat behind the pilots, monitoring the aircraft systems, a standard cockpit setup for the 747. From a technical crew perspective, this aircraft was in safe hands. But what no one knew, not the passengers, not even the crew, was that this aircraft carried with it a hidden time bomb. 7 years earlier, in 1978, this same aircraft had suffered a tail strike during a rough landing. The damage was repaired, but incorrectly. A key structural plate, called the splice plate, was improperly installed by Boeing technicians. The error went unnoticed for years, but each pressurization cycle, every takeoff and landing, placed immense strain on this flawed repair. The structure that should have lasted over 60,000 flight cycles was only strong enough for 11,000. Yet Flight 123 was now at 12,500. That day, this flaw would become fatal. At 6:12 p.m., Flight 123 took off from runway 15L at Haneda Airport. The weather was clear in Tokyo, but thunderstorms elsewhere in Japan forced air traffic control to reroute the plane over the ocean rather than its usual inland route. The flight was short, just 1 hour and 12 minutes to Osaka. The aircraft climbed steadily to its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. Inside, passengers settled into their seats, relaxed, chatted, or gazed out over Sagami Bay. But then, at 6:24 p.m., exactly 12 minutes into the flight, disaster struck. A loud explosion rocked the aircraft. Inside the cabin, passengers screamed as a section of the tail cone blew off, creating a massive decompression. Oxygen masks dropped. Loose items flew backward toward the breach. The loud, unnatural noise of rushing air filled the cabin. In the cockpit, the crew immediately knew something was wrong, but had no idea what exactly had failed. On the cockpit voice recorder, they speculated. Maybe it's the landing gear doors? Or the engine? But it was neither. The entire aft pressure bulkhead, the structural wall that seals the pressurized cabin from the tail, had ruptured. The vertical stabilizer, tail fin, had torn off. Even worse, all 4 hydraulic lines, which run through the tail and are essential for controlling the aircraft's flight surfaces, were now severed. In an instant, Japan Air 123 lost all hydraulic pressure, and with it, all flight controls. No rudder, no elevators, no ailerons, no flaps, no spoilers. The entire flight control system was now unresponsive. The pilots could move the controls, but the plane wouldn't respond. They were essentially flying a 300-ton glider with no steering wheel. To make things worse, due to the breach, cabin pressure dropped to near zero. Oxygen masks deployed, but many of them didn't work properly. The cabin crew was heard urgently instructing passengers to stay seated and fasten seat belts. Inside the cockpit, Captain Takahama switched the transponder to emergency frequency 7700, a universal distress signal. Instantly, ATC knew something was terribly wrong. The captain requested emergency return to Tokyo, and ATC granted clearance, instructing a 90 degrees right turn toward Haneda. But when the first officer tried to bank the aircraft, it tilted far too steeply. A simple 40 degrees turn became a violent roll. The captain shouted, "Reduce the bank angle." But nothing worked. The aircraft had a mind of its own. The flight engineer then delivered the worst news possible. Hydraulic pressure is 0. In that moment, all 3 cockpit crew members understood. They were no longer in control of the aircraft. For those unfamiliar, all large aircraft rely on hydraulic power to move their flight control surfaces. Without it, even the strongest pilot cannot physically move the wings, tail, or flaps. And now, at 24,000 feet, Flight 123 was a ghost ship, flying on momentum alone. Meanwhile, passengers were suffering from hypoxia, a condition caused by low oxygen levels. It leads to confusion, poor judgment, loss of consciousness, and eventually, death. Back in the cockpit, despite having no controls, the pilots refused to give up. They discovered one last option: engine thrust. By increasing power to the left engines, they could induce a right turn. By increasing right engine thrust, they could bank left. This was imprecise, dangerous, and difficult, but it was the only tool they had. Miraculously, using engine controls alone, the crew regained partial control of the aircraft's roll and pitch. But the side-to-side steering, was almost impossible. Next, they needed to descend, not just to reach the airport, but to increase air pressure in the cabin and save lives. Since the elevators, which control nose-up/down, were unresponsive, the captain tried to extend the landing gear to create drag and force the aircraft to descend. Normally, gear deployment also uses hydraulics, but this time, gravity did the job. The landing gear dropped into place, slowing the plane. By 6:45 p.m., the aircraft had dropped to 13,500 feet, circling above the city of Atsuki. In the cabin, oxygen levels stabilized, for now. But they weren't out of danger. Tokyo still lay ahead, and navigating toward it using only engine thrust was nearly impossible, especially in mountainous terrain. At 6:48 p.m., the captain was heard saying, "Turn right, there's a mountain ahead." But the aircraft couldn't respond quickly enough. Engine thrust changes take time. It was like trying to steer a car using only the gas pedal. Alarms blared inside the cockpit as the aircraft neared the mountains of Gunma Prefecture. At 6,800 feet, just above treetop level, the aircraft's erratic flight path finally came to a tragic end. At 6:56 p.m., Flight 123, still flying uncontrollably, struck a ridge on Mount Takamagahara, breaking apart in a horrific crash. Out of 524 people on board, only 4 survived, all women, all seated near the rear center of the aircraft. The rest, passengers, pilots, cabin crew, were lost. The investigation. In the aftermath, investigators discovered that the tail strike incident from 1978 had never been properly repaired. Boeing engineers had incorrectly installed the splice plate, compromising the structural integrity of the aft pressure bulkhead. It was only designed to withstand 11,000 pressurization cycles. Flight 123 had crossed 12,500. The rest was inevitable. In flight simulators, multiple professional pilots were put through the same failure scenario. Every single one of them crashed within minutes. None were able to keep the aircraft flying for even half the time that the crew of Flight 123 did. With no controls, no hydraulics, and only engine thrust. Captain Masami Takahama and his crew kept the plane in the sky for 45 minutes. It was a heroic, futile fight against a fate that had been sealed years earlier by a maintenance error. Their effort and the tragic story of Japan Air 123 remains one of aviation's most unforgettable lessons in human courage, mechanical vulnerability, and the razor-thin line between survival and catastrophe. Controlling the aircraft was now beyond what the autopilot could handle. On the ground, a bystander noticed the strange, unstable movement of the plane, and sensing something was wrong, he snapped a photo. In that photo, it was clearly visible. The rudder was completely missing from the tail. Before the cockpit crew could fully grasp the severity of the situation, the cabin crew's voices came over the intercom, urging passengers to fasten their seat belts and remain seated. Captain Takahama, sensing that this was a grave emergency, immediately switched the aircraft's transponder to code 7700, the universal signal for distress. This action automatically alerted all nearby control towers that Japan Air 123 was in a critical emergency. The captain's first decision was to try and return to Tokyo for an emergency landing. But the question remained, was the plane even capable of flying back? Captain Takahama contacted Tokyo Air Traffic Control, reported the emergency, and requested permission to return. The tower responded and cleared the aircraft to make a 90-degree right turn back toward Haneda Airport. Following orders, First Officer Sasaki attempted a right turn by banking the aircraft at a 40-degree angle. But to their shock, the aircraft kept rolling far beyond that. The bank angle was dangerously steep. Alarmed, the captain shouted, "Reduce the bank angle." No matter how hard the co-pilot tried, the controls weren't responding. Then came the final blow. The flight engineer reported that hydraulic pressure was falling rapidly, and moments later, it dropped to zero. That was when all three cockpit crew members fully realized the horrible truth. The aircraft was completely uncontrollable. For those unfamiliar with aircraft mechanics, all primary flight controls, like the ailerons for rolling left and right, elevators for pitch control, and flaps for slowing down, rely entirely on hydraulic power to function. At high speeds and altitudes, it's physically impossible to move them without hydraulic assistance. When the tail section detached midair, it didn't just remove the rudder, it also tore through vital hydraulic lines. As a result, the aircraft had suffered a total hydraulic failure. The cockpit controls were now just lifeless instruments, visually intact, but functionally useless. At 24,000 feet, Japan Air 123 was now fighting against a complete loss of cabin pressure, deployment of oxygen masks, zero hydraulic pressure, no response from flight controls, and the onset of hypoxia, a condition where low oxygen levels impair brain function, leading to confusion, slow reactions, and eventually unconsciousness. The cabin crew could now be heard urging passengers to put on their oxygen masks as the plane began wildly swaying from side to side, terrifying everyone on board. In the cockpit, there was only one thing left the pilots could still control: the engines. Captain Takahama made the extraordinary decision to control the aircraft using only engine thrust. To turn right, they would increase thrust on the left engines. To turn left, they'd apply more thrust on the right engines. And if the plane tilted too far in one direction, carefully adjusting engine power could help level it, at least temporarily. Amazingly, this method worked. The pilots managed to regain some limited control over the aircraft's roll. Now they had one objective: get the aircraft back to Tokyo and land it safely. But before they could think of landing, they needed to descend to a lower altitude, where cabin pressure and oxygen levels would be safer. Under normal circumstances, this descent would be managed using the elevators. But with no hydraulics, that wasn't an option. Then the captain had an idea. Deploying the landing gear would increase drag, forcing the aircraft to slow down and descend. Although the gear is hydraulically operated, it also has a gravity drop mechanism for emergencies. Thankfully, gravity did the trick. The landing gear deployed successfully. At 6:45 p.m., Japan Air 123 circled over the town of Otsuki and managed to descend from 24,000 feet to 13,500 feet, a crucial milestone. The oxygen levels in the cabin improved, buying more time. But the situation remained critical. They still needed to make a right turn to get back to Tokyo. But using only engine thrust, the maneuver was extremely difficult. Worse still, increasing thrust to make a turn often caused the plane's nose to rise, which reduced airspeed. Too low a speed would mean a stall, and then a crash. Unintentionally, the aircraft had now entered mountainous terrain. Flying low and without working control surfaces, trying to navigate back to Tokyo was becoming impossible. At 6:48 p.m., the captain urgently called out to the first officer, "Turn right, there's a mountain ahead." But with only engine thrust at their disposal, making a sharp, precise turn was nearly impossible. Multiple alarms blared in the cockpit as the aircraft flew just 6,800 feet above the peaks. By 6:54 p.m., the captain's voice was filled with panic and desperation. 2 minutes later, the cockpit voice recorder captured the final moments. Screams, alarms, and a deafening impact. At 6:56 p.m., Japan Airlines Flight 123 struck a mountain ridge while attempting to turn, ending one of the most heartbreaking and heroic chapters in aviation history. Of the 524 people on board, only 4 survived, all seated in the rear center section on the left side of the plane. Every other passenger and crew member perished in the crash. In the investigation that followed, a shocking revelation came to light. 7 years earlier, during a hard landing, the plane's tail had struck the runway. The aircraft had been grounded for extensive repairs carried out by Boeing technicians. But tragically, the repairs were flawed. The splice plate meant to reinforce the tail had been improperly installed. This faulty repair could withstand just 11,000 pressurization cycles. Japan Air 123 had already flown over 12,500. It failed that day, on August 12, 1985. To fully understand the impossibility of what the pilots achieved, 4 test pilots were placed in simulators and given the exact same failure scenario. All 4 crashed. None could keep the plane airborne as long as the crew of Japan Air 123. And remember, those test pilots knew what was wrong. They weren't facing death. Yet even they couldn't last as long. That's why it's not an exaggeration to call the flight crew's efforts heroic. They kept a crippled aircraft flying, without any control, for 45 minutes. Their determination, calm under pressure, and teamwork gave the 4 survivors a chance to live, and left behind a legacy of courage and sacrifice. We hope this story moved you as much as it moved us. Thank you for watching this video on Projects and Worlds. We'll see you next time with another extraordinary story from the world.